Welcome to this short lecture on productivity of labor, which we often just call productivity for short. And our particular goal is to ask this question: why is productivity so important? If you read economic news, listen to economists, speeches by economists, and so on, you'll hear a lot about productivity. In particular, in the past few years, worries about the slowdown in productivity growth, worries about what this will mean for wages, thinking about policies to impact productivity. So clearly, for economists, productivity is an important concept. And the short answer for why it's so important is that productivity is closely connected to a country's standard of living. A country that's more productive will typically have a higher standard of living. So what we'll do for the rest of this lecture is first think about how we can measure standard of living economically, and then see how that standard of living measure is connected to productivity. So as a first pass, we might think a good way to measure a country's standard of living is to look at its GDP, which is represented by Y here. And remember, whenever we say GDP, we're implicitly referring to real GDP. We'll specify explicitly if it's nominal GDP. The problem with using GDP alone, just GDP as a measure of standard of living, is that, well, there's two problems, so we'll take them in turn. The first problem is that when we look at the components broken down here, so I have GDP has four components: consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. At least two of these don't have any real clear connection to our standard of living. In particular, investment, and remember, investment would be primarily things like building factories, equipment used in factories, and so on. That's not something that you really think of as contributing to your standard of living. Consumption contributes to your standard of living if you can consume more stuff. That's better food, more computers, playing more games, seeing more movies. But investment would be just like having more factories. That's not directly contributing to your standard of living. You don't enjoy like looking at those factories, and especially probably don't enjoy working on them. So we don't really want to count investment as part of our standard of living. We also probably don't want to count net exports as part of our standard of living, because if we build a lot of stuff and then export it, that's great, that contributes to our GDP, but it's not directly contributing to your standard of living because other people got that stuff. You exported it, clearly other people have it now, so you're not enjoying that, which is unfortunate. So one thing we could do is say, we're really just going to focus on consumption as part of our standard of living. But then we get a second problem. If we're going to use consumption as our standard of living, a country like Nigeria might have a pretty high amount of total consumption, even though by pretty much any reasonable standard, intuitively, Nigeria is a very poor country. And the problem is, consumption can be large either because each person consumes a lot and has a high standard of living, or because there's just a lot of people. So Nigeria has 150 million people or so they have a lot of consumption in total, but not a lot per person. So what we'll do is we'll use consumption divided by the population as our measure of standard of living. So this is connected to GDP because we're focusing on a component of GDP, but we've adjusted it by focusing specifically on that consumption component and by adjusting for the size of the population. And the terminology for that is focusing on a per capita measure. Anything measured per capita is per person standard of living. All right. So now we have our measure of standard of living. It's consumption per person or per capita. Now we're going to do a little bit of math so that we can break down this measure into components, different factors that contribute to our standard of living, and we'll see how productivity is really the most important component. So to do that, we'll start by defining savings rate so that consumption is 1 minus savings rate times GDP. So intuitively, all this says is that consumption is the part of GDP that isn't saved. It's the part you actually get to consume. And this definition doesn't exactly match with our one above because net exports really have nothing to do with saving. But if you think of a closed economy or an economy with not a lot of net exports, then this definition should make a lot of intuitive sense. Your consumption is whatever you don't save, so it's the fraction of GDP left over after saving. Now we can write consumption equals 1 minus S times y. Then we want to divide both sides by population because that's our measure of standard of living, C per capita. So we'll divide by population on the right. And then the last thing I want to do is I'm going to multiply the numerator and the denominator by the number of workers, the amount of labor, L. So I'll put an L here and an L here. And what you notice is, the L here and the L here cancel. So that didn't really change anything. I just multiplied by L over L, which is 1, and the two L's will cancel. But what it'll help us do is to think about these three different factors we can see now and how each of them contributes to our standard of living. Specifically, now we have 1 minus the savings rate as a factor that contributes to the standard of living. We have the number of workers as a fraction of the population. That's what we call the labor force participation rate. So I'll write that here, labor force participation rate. You could also get more workers per population by just, this is really more like hours worked, so you could have individual people working more hours too. But roughly speaking, it's labor force participation. So this is non-saving rate. And then this term in the middle, the Y over L, is by definition productivity, which, as I said earlier, is short for productivity of labor. So now we can look at these three terms and see that if we're going to get standard of living to improve over time, or just to have a high standard of living ever, we're going to either have to have a very high non-savings rate, which means save very little, or high productivity, or a really, really high labor force participation rate. In practice, if you want your standard of living to grow, the first thing, raising your non-savings rate's a non-starter. If you want to have a high standard of living in the long run, if you want to grow, if anything, you should be doing a lot of saving. Intuitively, the more you save, the more you'll accumulate them in terms of investments, in terms of capital, in terms of things you can use to grow your economy. So lowering your savings rate to consume more might be good, over the very short term, but really bad over the long term. So that's not going to be the key to a high standard of living and a growing standard of living. We can focus on the third term, labor force participation rate. From year to year, you can probably get this to go up. You could get more young people in the workforce. You could get people to retire later. You could find people who are unemployed or who are disabled and maybe develop new medical treatments to help them accommodate them in the workforce. But over a long stretch of time, ultimately there's a limit on the fraction of the labor force that you could really get working. Maybe you could get 80% of the people working, but then to get beyond that, you might have to start getting 10-year-olds working or 90-year-olds working, and you really probably don't want to force 10-year-olds to work. So that's not going to be the secret to long-run growth. So we can see that if non-saving and labor force participation are not going to be the keys to growth in our standard of living, productivity is going to have to be the key. The secret is the reason productivity is so important is if we can cause productivity to grow, we can raise our standard of living. It's really the only way we can raise our standard of living is by raising our productivity. So understanding productivity growth is super important, and that answers our question that we started out with. In the next video, the follow-up to this, we're going to use growth accounting techniques to think about how we can increase our productivity over time. So after doing a little review for these concepts, go ahead and watch that closely related video.